Afternoon. Again, we're in another finance meeting. We haven't had one for a while, and Susan's got quite a lot on the agenda since we did have an audit that happened in the meantime and kind of wants to report on that. First, I want to thank all the commissioners. You all met with Mike and Susan to help us with the budget. I appreciate that. You all had some different topics that you took up with them, and hopefully they can take those into account as we reform the budget. So I appreciate the time you all took and the efforts you did with that. So Susan, are you ready to go, or do you need any introductions? We have some people here today, right? Or you'll introduce them as we go?
Yes, I'll introduce them as we go. Thanks. Can you Sorry. That's our guest spot. Thank you. Sorry. Yes, okay, so as the mayor mentioned, we do have a pretty full agenda today. So we have the standing items that we talk about every quarter. Some of these are things we looked at previously, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. On page 1, that is the year-to-date financials. That's also in your packet for the commission meeting this evening. It's through July 31st. A lot of the same comments. So our revenue is trending above budget, and our expenses are trending below budget. So year-to-date, we're at a positive almost $2.4 million.
Susan, excuse me, could you just get a little closer to the microphone, please?
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
Sorry. All right, so page 1, the summary is year-to-date, we are trending $2.4 million above the budget. And then the projection, we do quarterly projections. That's on page 2. At this point, we are projecting to have a break-even year. As we get a little farther into the fall, it starts to be a little easier to kind of fine-tune those projections, so we'll be spending more time on that. Key items on here are, obviously interest income is in our favor this year, and that will help offset the transit transfer that we're going to be making later this year. We'll bring that forward to the commission when we're ready to do that. And then on page 3 is year-to-date sales tax. This is actually outdated. We have kind of hot off the press a new one, and it's showing as of the last month, which would have been through June, trending at 2%. So we're moving from the negative to the positive. And as we've mentioned, can't really look at this every month. It fluctuates pretty wildly, so we need to look at it more on a historic basis.
Susan, with school starting and stuff, does that usually jump in the fall if we have shopping that happens that time, or is it, a reflection of what's going across the nation in which the inflation seems to get getting lower, people are not spending as much, or?
Well, this one, as I said, this is behind. So year-to-date, we're at about 2%. Really, I think it sort of depends on the randomness of how these are reported on a monthly basis. So you really just need to look at the trends. And so I'm not comfortable saying one way or another yet. I'll look at it a little more closely as we get farther into the year. Any other questions? Okay, so then moving to 3, the discussion topics. We have with us today Brian Stavenger with Eide Bailly. He's going to go over the 2023 year-end audit. Ryan Pappenfuss with the Finance Department is going to sit up here as well and answer any questions you might have.
While Susan pulls this up, thank you for the introduction. Brian Stavenger, partner with Eide Bailly. Good to see some of you again, and some new faces as well. Just the annual audit update. This is always related to the most previous fiscal year that's been completed. So this audit is for the year ended 12/31/23. Issued the audit right at the end of June, which is consistent with previous years, and then typically in August is when we meet to discuss really the high-level results of the audit. There is a full, referred to as an ACFR, Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. It is, I think, almost 300 pages now, 200 pages. It's long. So this is very high level, very summarized, and intended to be that way. Definitely encourage you all to read through the details of the financial statements and audit, but I'll give you that high level overview. I'll be sure to pause periodically to make sure that if there's any questions or added comments or discussion that we have that opportunity. Otherwise, let's get started. So a little bit about Eide Bailly. If you're not familiar with us, top 25 accounting firm. We've been in business for many years, over 100 years. We've got a pretty robust government industry team that serves local governments from an audit, advisory, and consulting capacity. And so really happy to be able to provide all sorts of resources for whatever may come to be with the City of Fargo. The next slide, a little bit about the audit team. Myself here leading it as partner. Ultimately, I'm the one responsible to ensure that we're following all the correct rules from an audit perspective, and then from an accounting perspective, making sure the city is. But a robust team behind me, Courtney Braden, another Courtney, and others, all heavily involved in working through the audit. This is a pretty consistent team from the previous year, which definitely helps as we work through this pretty significant audit cycle. Next slide is looking at the various objectives that we follow as auditors. So at the very top, there's 3 different standards that we're following. The very top one, really, if there's any external financial statement audit being performed by any firm or any person, they're going to follow that top one. As you get into local government auditing, there's a few more standards that are required to be followed. So just a reminder of the different standards we follow, which help guide us through the audit. As we go through the audit, we're obtaining reasonable but not absolute assurance. So really what that means is that we are not looking at things 100%. We're looking at the higher risk areas, areas where we feel there could be potential misstatements, and we focus our procedures in those areas, not ignoring other areas, but we definitely focus on the higher risk areas. And then in the end, we do enough according to those standards to provide you that reasonable assurance that your financial statements are free of material misstatement. And then just a reminder of the timeline, which I mentioned the end or the issuance at the end of June. Really, we begin the bulk of our planning in December and really continue into the winter and early spring. Typically, year-end testing in April and May, and like I said, reporting in June. All very similar timelines compared to previous years. So this is all within our audit opinion, but I always like to point it out. There's management responsibilities and there's auditor responsibilities. There can be some misconception that essentially the auditors are in charge of everything, and that's just simply not factual. So I always like to point this out, that ultimately management is responsible for the financial statements, making sure they're fairly accurate, presented correctly according to the principles of governmental audit standards, and then also maintaining adequate internal controls. So really that's management's responsibilities. Our responsibilities, which is on the next slide, is to perform our procedures, as mentioned before, to obtain that reasonable assurance that all of those things that management is responsible for are indeed taking place, and then in the end we issue our opinion over the financial statements. That'll be on the next page. Received clean, unmodified opinions. That's what you want when you receive an external financial statement audit. That means there was everything, all the rules were followed. We don't believe there's any material misstatements. That clean, unmodified opinion. There was a new standard issued and adopted and implemented in fiscal year 23. GASB stands for Governmental Accounting Standards Board. They issue all the accounting requirements for local governments. You'll see towards the end of my presentation, we're now into the triple digits, which I don't think is really that exciting because it seems like every single year there is something new to implement. In 2023, implemented this one. It's really recording any IT subscription-based arrangements on the financial statements. A pretty minimal impact on the city, but just making sure that those are recorded as both an asset and a liability. But like I said, very minimal impact. Probably the most important, maybe not the most important, the second most important on here is no findings during the audit process. In the past few years, we have run into a few things, pretty minor, but in 2023, adequately addressed, and we did not find anything new to report as a finding. I'll go one more slide before I pause again. The federal audit, The city receives an audit over the federal funds every single year. There's a minimum threshold which the city far exceeds due to the size and in the volume of grants that you expend. There were 4 programs that we looked at specifically related to the federal audit. They're listed there. That is all driven by the federal government. They have guidelines and calculations as to what we're supposed to look at, when we're supposed to look at it. And those 4 programs were what we looked at in 2023. Also no findings in that federal audit, which is good to see. So I'll pause there to see if there's any questions so far on high-level results for both financial statements and federal audit. Okay, we also issue a separate letter to governance. It's probably about 4 pages, pretty boilerplate, but a few things I wanted to point out as you're reading through that. We list out any significant accounting estimates. So in the preparation of the financial statements, there's a few areas where there does have to be some estimates that are made. Pension accounting, other post-employment benefit accounting, landfill accounting, those are all significant estimates. We really just point that out. A little bit more challenging from an accounting standpoint as well as an auditing standpoint. So just more significant risks related to those, and we spend more time not only understanding but also testing how those estimates are made. We also list out any significant risks. This was new to put into writing probably about 3 years ago. And all it does is identify, I mentioned early on how we obtain that reasonable assurance. We usually look at the higher risk areas. This lists out those higher risk areas. Again, areas where there could be more potential for material misstatements, usually higher volume transactions, higher dollar transactions. We're going to make sure we're comfortable with those. There was an emphasis of matter, which was having to do with the implementation of that new GASB standard, so just pointing that out. And then for the second year, pointing out, and this will continue to be pointed out, but the Airport Authority now has its own separate audit. It ultimately is incorporated into the city's full financial statements, but they are audited separately, and we just point that out. Questions before we get into some actual numbers? Okay, so we're going to focus on the general fund for the next few pages, next few slides, really focusing on fund balance. So as I mentioned, that full financial statement has hundreds of pages, a lot of activity. We decided to focus on the main operating fund of the city, the general fund, and really break down the different fund balance categories, which are essentially the reserves at the end of the year. Look at those, or a 10-year history of those, and then really look at those compared to kind of what your internal informal policy is, as well as 10 years worth of that. So when you get to governmental accounting and what do you have for fund balance or reserves, it's not just one number, it's not just one category. As you can see, it's 5 different categories. Really, I'm going to focus on, I'll break them into about 3 subsets. Restricted is where there's an outside third-party restriction. So if you received, usually it's related to grant dollars, maybe state aid, usually from a state or federal government. There could be others. But if there's any remaining funds to be spent into the future, those are classified as restricted. They have to be spent on very specific items, so that's a big category. Committed and assigned is really an internal earmark that the city utilizes, so it doesn't have to be, but is intended to be spent on those specific activities. And then the far right here, unassigned, is really truly your reserves, rainy day fund, and that's what we'll be analyzing in a couple slides. But really just a reminder of how complicated fund balance and governmental accounting can be. So the next slide, we'll take a look at these broken down into different categories. You can see the purple is the unassigned, which is really the main reserves or rainy day fund. You can see the green is the restricted, so a lot of outside restricted, a lot of grant type funds that just carry over from year to year, but by far the most prevalent category, the unassigned. So those are the actual dollar amounts at the end of 2023, just over 31 million approximately of total fund balance, with the vast majority of that being unassigned, and we'll look at that compared to really the annual budget, which is on the next slide. And I'll make sure to pause after this one for any discussion or questions. So this is again looking at just the unassigned portion of that fund balance, comparing it to a percentage of expenditures in the general fund, essentially your budgeted expenditures. That line across the top Can't tell if it's purple, it's a little darker. At the 25% level, that is the city's internal informal goal on an annual basis to be at or near that 25%. You can see that for the first 8 years of this slide, it very much exceeded that. And then the last couple years, 2022 and 23, a little bit under that. So hovering right around 20% again for 2023. So what that means is if you took in no more revenues, you could operate for about 2.5 months. There is a national organization called the GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association. They recommend at a minimum no less than 2 months worth, or about 15%. So you can see you're exceeding that and you're just a little bit below your internal goal. So I'll pause there. I think we've got one more graph that looks at federal expenditures just to see if there's any questions or discussion.
This may be a little bit outside of the scope of your work, but I just reminded Susan, I know we've been working on the budget basically for a year, but where are we on a reserves policy and philosophy, coming back with a recommendation to the commission?
Yeah, I'm still gathering information on different policy examples, and as Brian mentioned, the GFOA is a good example for that. I was going to point out, so the previous slide showed that the dollar of the fund balance either went up slightly or stayed about the same. The reason this is going down is it's a percentage of expenditures, so as our general fund grows, if the fund balance is flat, then the percentage is going to drop. So that's something we need to be aware of. As we look at the fund balance, we've been talking about as perhaps proper parcels come up for sale, how important it is to not put those revenues into the budget stream. Those are not sustainable. So this is where those monies would go as we look at doing some sort of asset sales down the road.
Brian, I'm just curious, something that I would benefit from, I think, and it's not essential right now, but I'd like us to have a similar deep dive into our whole debt side of of the city. All the bonded indebtedness, the nature of them, the timelines of them, the scope of them, just for my sake, at some point, that would be really valuable. And I'm not sure it'd be who would do that, but it's not the most essential thing right now for today's budgeting, but long haul, it'd be good to get that on our radar, in my opinion.
That would actually, I think, be a good topic for this meeting and
Yes.
future meetings. I've put together, I don't know, I call it like the big picture map, and I'd like for us to start looking at that so you can see where the general fund is and what other funds are available and how they tie together. So I think that would be a good segue into that topic as well.
Susan, while I'm at it, usually what we've done in the past is meet individually with Eide Bailly. Is this the replacement for that?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
Although if they want to meet individually,
you
they
can
can.
certainly meet individually if you'd like.
Okay, the next slide, representation of the federal dollars expended for the last 10 years. I think we put this in starting last year because you can see in 2022 it started to decline and really get back to, I would say, more of the normal federal dollars that are being expended. So really just to continue to display that the city really in 2023 is more back to that normal level. It was so abnormal starting in 2020 and continued to receive and expend those dollars. So approximately 45 million in 2023 of federal dollars were expended, which you can see on this graph is very much in line with pre-2020 federal dollars. Now that's going to be dependent on different types of programs that may come up that may increase that, may decrease that a little bit. Usually capital related tend to increase that substantially, but if it's just the kind of the normal ongoing federal programs, we would expect it to be pretty similar to pre-2020 levels.
And in this, do you have the airport's money they got for COVID? They had 20 million, 24 million. That's probably not included in this, I would assume.
It is not included.
Thank you.
Okay, what's next? There's those 3-digit GASBs, which everyone in the finance department is so excited about. Not really. The only potential impact or likely impact will be GASB 101. Actually, both of them will have an impact, but GASB 101, compensated absences in the last 10 years It used to be vacation, sick leave, and that was about it. Across the country, GASB took a look at, there's military leave, there's parental leave, there's all different kinds of leave, and the previous standards didn't really capture how to calculate and report all of that. So GASB 101 has accomplished that. Talked briefly with Wyatt before the presentation, and they're already looking into it, and hopeful that it's not a significant impact and significant lift for the finance department. But that will be something we'll revisit next year at this time and let you know how that impacted the financial statements. I mentioned the timeline previously, really the bulk of our work done December through June, but throughout the year we're in touch. We're a resource that the city can utilize as they go through ERP implementation. Anything else related to finance, we usually have people who have that experience and background who can at least provide advice as they're going through that. So just a reminder that we've got a really strong relationship, very comfortable to talk through things throughout the year. Last slide, I guess this last slide before it's got my contact information and a big thank you. Is any final questions, comments, or discussion points?
I'm just curious, maybe Susan, this is another future topic, but I'm wondering what the implications and impacts of the transition to defined contribution pensions will be to us relative to defined benefit pensions. And I think is that starting January 1 or so? So I'm just wondering how that will affect our lay of the land and our cash flow and our everything. I'm kind of absent on knowledge on that topic.
The logistics won't change significantly. There'll still be a match portion for the employer and the employee. I haven't looked significantly at the financial implications of that. I don't think it's going to change much. We'll be working with HR, and we can provide some more information on that towards the end of the year.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Always seems to be disappointing when you have no findings, but that's what you're supposed to do. So thank you for doing that. That's a compliment to our team. Thank you, Susan.
The city's audit is on our website under the finance department. You can look for it and click into the 300 and some page document that I mentioned. So it's available for the public if they're interested. Okay, the next item on the agenda is I want to have a conversation about fall appropriation bonds. And so Steve Scharf with Baker Tilly is here. You might remember Brad Elmer was here the last time we had bonds last fall. Brad has taken another position within Baker Tilly. So Steve is now going to be our direct contact. I've worked with Steve quite a bit. Steve worked with Brad and put together a lot of the bond models, particularly with the Fargo Dome. So he's very familiar with the city of Fargo, and he's been helping with getting ready for the fall monies. We've talked about at a couple different meetings the need to find the remaining funding for the MP parking lot. Just as an update, we have half of that funded through the Bank of North Dakota 2% loan, and then we're going to do a bond for the remaining. And then the other areas are purchasing the police department and a few other items that we'll talk about in just a minute. Sorry, let me get you set up.
Sure, and good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. Just as a, I suppose, added comment to working with Brad, I think if I could say one thing, I am a bit of a common thread just throughout the relationship that you all have had for a long-standing or a long time with Baker Tilly. I think I sort of cut my teeth for a while with Terry Heaton, if you remember that name, and then working with Brad on a lot of elements for the financings you've had in the recent past. So I'm looking forward to continue working with you all, and excited to sort of be in a more face-to-face role than what you might have seen me in the past, just through emails or notes and that sort of thing. So looking forward to the conversation today. I appreciate the time as always, and we'll just kind of get right into it. So we've put in together some information that hopefully you all find helpful. As Susan mentioned, this is a discussion around the annual appropriation bonds for the financing of the remaining portion of NP parking garage, as well as a various number of capital items for the city just as a whole. I'd imagine it's the big black button. All right, perfect. So here we've listed out, you might notice from the front page of the presentation that we're looking at or proposing 2 series of obligations here. And I'll get to some more details of why that's the case here in a minute. But just as some more detail into which one is financing what particular projects, we've listed those out for you all for consideration as there's a resolution element to this that'll be presented later today. You can see the 2024 F bonds. Those are the taxable obligations that we're listing here. That's for the NP parking facility, the remainder portion there. $8 million of project funding, if you've looked at the resolution, or as you will. The number is a little higher than that. This accounts for the project funding, so what actually goes into paying for the improvements throughout the city. There is, of course, added costs of issuance that go on top of that. So the number from a principal side is around the 9.3 million or 9 million mark for that obligation. Of course, these numbers are all preliminary, and I'll get to timing more here in a bit as to when we'll have those final numbers. But these are estimates at this point based on market information and feedback from the underwriter. For the 2024 G bonds, those are the tax exempt obligations. As Susan mentioned, there's a list of projects being financed, with the bulk of it being the police department, making up roughly around half of the overall financing there. Just as a note, any opportunity that we can, if there's project needs that we're working with finance staff on funding, we do try to aggregate those up the best we can. There's a lot of efficiencies that get created when you can minimize the number of bonds being brought to market. As you can imagine, anytime you issue a series of debt, there's payment of professionals and issuance costs that go along with that. And as fiduciary to the city, we try to keep those as low as possible.
Could we back up, please, to that? Just if you wouldn't mind, go back to that slide, please.
Sure.
A couple questions. The PD building, you know, that purchase just was solidified how recently? The purchase of the police building from Border States?
Within the last few months or so, I believe the contract was approved at City Commission, and the funding date is November 30th.
Okay, and so I'm gonna go on this topic for a moment. And 2.9 for HVAC for the police station going forward. Does that mean we're not talking right now about a new police station? Or, okay. Last thought, I'll just.
The police station is long-term goal, John, and the police chief has presented that to us, but we don't have anything, we're not financing it. I think Commissioner Pipcorn and myself, when we went through the Border States Electric building, it's a beautiful building, working very well. Unfortunately, HVAC has to be revised, which is a big cost we did not expect. But for now, we feel it's going to be headquarters for a while, and long-term, the commission can eventually look for future plans. But it's no different than Fire Station number 8. I think that was a dream for 5 to 6 years before we finally built.
My last observation, just to share it with us going forward, we're going to have more moments, opportunities like this, but I remember when the transition from Border States was happening, and I was concerned then, well, why don't we just buy it now or establish the purchase price now? Because we put millions of dollars into this building, we're leasing, and then the price escalates in our purchase. You know, so I think that we need to look at those approaches when we're going to buy a building, do a lease purchase up front. I mean, I'm guessing, I thought it was 5-6 million back then, and I'm just out of my head, but either way, that's a practice going forward. When we're going to buy a building, we arrange the terms up front, just like we do in the private world. You know, set up a lease purchase or an agreement that establishes the purchase price right up in the beginning. So we're not later on, I don't know how much we put into that building, but and I saw the school district do this too, where they take a building, rent it, and put millions into it, and then buy it later. It's just an observation for our own internal practices is all.
That's a good point. I wasn't here at the time, but I know it was several years ago. It might have been during COVID, and there might have been different circumstances that they were working on, but I think that's a good point for future purchases.
I do wanted to highlight, and I appreciate the commentary there, and I've been taking notes along the way for items of discussion down the road as we think about these elements of financing. Some of the considerations that are made in terms of why annual appropriation bonds, and then to some respect, of course, the tax provisions related to that. Really, some of the elements that kind of drive that decision in this case really go by the timing and the nature of the projects. This initially started on the NP parking garage. Annual appropriation nature-based obligations tend to make a lot of sense there. It's not directly placing a burden on the general obligation authority of the city, while still maintaining a pretty low cost of financing, all things considered. It is a credit rateable product or offering in the marketplace. You all have a very strong rating with that respect there. So from that end, we really look to try to put that element together the best we can, and that's the consideration made here. We have clear authority here on the city's charter, and then when it comes down to method of sale, there's considerations we always look to make there. In this case, which I will highlight a little bit more later on in the discussion, a negotiated sale or a public offering being negotiated with D.A. Davidson makes good sense here from that perspective. We went through a competitive process for that, so regardless of method of sale, again, as financial advisor, we always try to drive competition in that. And in this case, we did an RFP or request for proposals for underwriting on that element of it. And D.A. Davidson, and of course, you might recognize the name Paul Donna, has a longstanding history with the city. He has good knowledge of the city, and of course, he brings good ideas as well, regardless of the flag he flies. In this case, I think we have to give him some good credit to the Bank of North Dakota. As part of that proposal, he did raise that as an idea, and it makes a lot of sense, at least in some form of funding what we can with that. Interest rates are very low for that program. There is a limit there, so we can't fully fund the project with that, but to the extent we could, we thought that made a lot of sense there. The other elements, presidential election or elections in general tend to create a lot of market volatility, which lends itself to having a finer touch, if I could call it that, with having an underwriter help prepare the offering and really help guide that offering to market. As municipal advisor, we're not allowed to talk to investors because that would be a pretty big conflict there. Of course, our side being the city's, it wouldn't really make a lot of sense for them to just take our word for it, and that's why the underwriter's there to help that process. So all that being said, we are recommending a negotiated sale for this, and again, through that competitive process, selecting D.A. Davidson for the merits I've mentioned. Questions on that? So tax provisions, of course, an important element to financing in general. We always try to fit within the tax exempt provisions where they're appropriate and where we can. In this case, as I mentioned before, the Series 2024 G bonds are financing a good bulk of the listed projects as tax exempt obligations. And those are squarely public purpose, public use, public benefit. No real concerns from a tax side, and no real direct need for a huge amount of flexibility down the road for that with those obligations outstanding. So tax exempt makes good sense there. You receive the benefit of having that lower tax exempt rate relative to taxable, which is always a helpful thing from the cost side. On the NP parking, there are some elements there where we have to stay cognizant of private use or private benefit. Parking facilities tend to lend themselves to that quite frequently. Anytime you talk about leasing spaces on a long-term basis to private entities, for example, that can create a tax issue that is best to be avoided, so we don't have a retroactive tax concern on the bonds. And not to dwell on the sort of downside of having a taxable obligation, you get the added flexibility of being able to have those agreements down the road and not having to worry about tax exemption and getting that benefit from contracting and stability with those revenues long term. Again, just as an example. So all that said, of course, we work very close with bond counsel to make those determinations. Of course, I'm not a tax attorney, so ultimately that will be up to them, but we've already been in discussion with them, and that's where those tax provisions lie. And we have a clear path forward on the 2024 G bonds being tax exempt there. So another consideration, of course, being the market. So we talk about interest rates in relation to the tax provisions. Here's a highlight of just the municipal market overall. I stretched this out over a span of about 2 years. To the far right, we can see that's where we sort of currently sit on municipal benchmarks. So while this isn't a direct, here's what the city's interest rate would be, it's a benchmark for the municipal market that all tax exempt bonds price off of. And it's a good just give indication of where the market is. And so one thing I do want to highlight here is we did see a peak in interest rates towards the end of last year. There was a strong narrative and resulting inflation that we all know we felt. The market had a maintained expectation that that was going to stick around for a while, and they've priced that in. So we can see the sort of peak there, and then very quickly, inflation started to slow down. We started seeing some cracks in the market, I guess is one way of calling it, or some slowdown in the market to where inflation wasn't as high. I think the peaks were at 1.8% or so. So very high. Now it's somewhere around the 3% range. And the market's expecting that slowdown to start occurring. So while not necessarily a good thing for the economy, a good thing for borrowing money because that means rates tend to go down. And I'll get to another driver that gets looked at quite a bit here in a second. But overall, I think the message being in the near years, looking in the past, we're in a pretty good spot in the market for borrowing money relative to history. And since we are talking about issuing taxable bonds, I want to bring up the taxable benchmark. So in that case, it's U.S. Treasuries. It's another risk-free index that gets used for pricing municipal debt on the taxable side. As I mentioned before, taxable investors are going to expect a little bit higher rate of return because they get taxed on their income. And as a result of that, a little bit higher interest rate on the city's end. So we can see here 3.83 and 4.12% respectively, both for the 10 and 30 year. So those long-term rates are largely going to be what drives the cost of financing for the city. While we do like to look at the Fed, and again, I'll get to that in a second, that's a very short-term interest rate. So it's a good measure of where expectations economically are going to be going. It's not a one-for-one on what the city's cost of funds would look like. So we look at benchmarks, at least I do daily, and generally I get a pretty good read throughout the day what's going on. And so far, while we have seen some volatility just with this sort of continued change in expectations on what the Fed's going to do for the rest of the year, again, it is off of those highs that we saw late last year. So the Fed, this sort of mysterious groups of folks that tend to drive large decisions on what things cost for us on a daily basis. I wanted to provide, this is what you're looking at here, a probability table. So without getting too far into the weeds on all the math and markets that go behind it, basically it's an representation of what investors or what the market expects the Fed to do throughout the year. And I provided the December expectation date as a good measure of just what we might expect for the rest of the year. And I have to caveat that with this changes a lot. Last week we saw consumer price and producer price information come in at or lower than expected, which is good for interest rates. And then on Thursday we saw retail sales, so maybe a little bit of that sales tax component, higher than expected. So that tended to put the market in a bit of a tizzy on Thursday of what's happening, what's the Fed going to do, all because of one piece of information coming out. So that's sort of the environment we're in. So these expectations change day to day, but the general trend still seems to be pretty consistent throughout, and that is we should expect Fed rate cuts between now and the end of the year. So I think based on what you're seeing here, what it's telling you is the strength of the expectation of how much that looks like by the end of the year. And in this case, it's sort of jury's still out. we're kind of at a 50-50 or a 40-40 point here where the expectation is somewhere in the 4.5 to 4.25 range, being largely the number that folks are going to be looking at by the end of the year. But it's not decided at this point. And of course, we still have plenty of time left for new information to come out and these revisions to continue to occur. But I think the big takeaway here is the market is expecting the Fed to cut rates at some point this year. It's just a matter of how much. I do really want to stick a caveat on that, though. COVID did happen at one point, and there was a market expectation the day before everybody went home, and very quickly after that, that expectation changed quite a bit. So, knock on wood, nothing like that happens that big anytime soon. But I do want to caveat that, again, this is going to change. I would expect it to change, but the trend or the expectation overall is still been consistent for a while that the Fed's going to cut. So what does that mean in terms of thinking about timing here? And I've provided a calendar towards the end of this discussion, but some elements that we've considered just throughout. Again, I mentioned the election tends to create some volatility in the market, and that's not saying we can't enter it, but generally it's something that we would try to avoid if we can for a number of reasons. Anytime there's a lack of clarity in the result of that election, or maybe a surprise in any case, it'll create some volatility in the market that, like I said, if we can avoid it, let's try to do that. It tends to be a coin flip whether you get lucky on that or you look back and go, gee, I wish we would have. So best to avoid if we can. Usually that lasts kind of a week on either side, so it's not like the rest of the year is sort of written off or anything like that, but we do look to try to keep some distance between that day.
This is maybe a comment for Susan and team also, but looking at NP Avenue, the NP Garage and other, I'd in no parking commissioner board right now. I think I would also at some point like to get a better update on the cash flow of our parking revenues and costs and expenses, and because I just don't know where we all landed in the past with that, but I know there were question marks. But at some point, that'd be another appraisal for me that would be really beneficial is.
Correct. We did have a meeting with, regarding parking in May. I don't remember if you were there, but I had projected out a cash flow, so was given the directive to watch that pretty closely. So we'll be bringing that forward to you. But this debt that we're talking about was built into that cash flow.
Yeah, we do continue to structure that NP parking obligation to fit within those cash flows that we're given to. Again, election timing is certainly a consideration here. And so with that, we are, we made some considerations versus do we wait till after, do we go before? In this case, it's probably better just to try to get this process started sooner than later, and that's part of the reason why we're talking here today. Just again, to provide us some distance, and of course, the timing for project needs is another element to consider as well. So I think if we keep a tally, it's probably somewhere north of 60 or 70% of the overall funding that we have included in these two bonds. We need the funding, or the city needs the funding by the end of the year, with some of that or a large portion of that needed by November. Generally, when we're working with guidelines like that, we try to build in some room. Getting to the last point, time allows flexibility. So anytime we can start this process sooner to where we're not bumping up against that cash flow need timeline, it does give us some flexibility that if something were to happen in the market, we can pivot to a different day if necessary. And we certainly don't take that lightly, but that's something we always try to position our clients to have the best success on sale day and pricing, all things considered. And I highlighted already funding needs being another primary driver, almost equally or more important than the election. We want to make sure we can deliver funding on or before when you need it, so that we're not in any cash flow constraints on the project side. So next steps, we've laid out a plan of finance here and laid out timing that we've factored in a lot of considerations on. I wanted to give some highlights just on major items throughout that process that are worth noting here. Of course, a lot of work goes into time between the dates listed here, but certainly some of the milestone elements being some of the items that will be brought before you. So what we're looking at today or later today is a consideration of resolutions just authorizing us to sell bonds. You know, that's going to be largely preliminary at this point. We've provided estimates on principal amounts. Of course, we laid out the projects being funded, and then some of the other authorized uses of funds, again, going into that issuance cost component as well. We do have a provision for a reserve account. That's not something that we've typically seen or done in the past, although it is a common element of annual appropriation bonds. We're keeping that in there as a measure defensively to make sure that we can package this offering to the market for the most success for the city. In that case, a reserve account might make sense just as we move forward. I just wanted to keep that in as a consideration and not sort of rule it out from the start and then run into something we would have to look to change down the road. Next element, I think, is worth noting, of course, the rating process. It takes several weeks, but we do have a rating call scheduled for the week of September 2nd. About a week and a half later, we'll expect to receive that rating back. That'll go right into the offering document that gets provided to investors. It gets put right on the front page. We, of course, like to brag about the city's rating to investors, so we try to do that any chance we can. And then the pre-marketing period, that's really when Paul Donna and D.A. Davidson, a lot of the work goes into their plate. They're going to go out and sell these two series of bonds to investors, and that's when they're going to start the heavy conversations with them about where they stand on the interest there. Between then and pricing, we will be coming back to you all. We're going to have another resolution or a set of resolutions that we'll be asking for consideration. That's going to lay out a lot of the terms and conditions. So again, the one that you have today is really a preliminary authorization just for us to keep going on this. And the September 6th resolution, that's going to prescribe a lot of the terms and conditions specific to each obligation. So if you think about prepayability, security provisions go into more in-depth, all the elements that are important and essential into the legal document side, that's when that's going to be brought forth. And then the exciting day, sale of the bonds. So we have that scheduled for September 20. That's when we'll take feedback from investors and set those interest rates and lock in the structure at that point. So we'll know from there going forward exactly how much the city's going to be paying every year, exactly what the interest rate looks like. All the numbers will be finalized, and then from there we'll work towards closing, which we have scheduled for October 3rd. That's when the city will receive funding for their project. So again, in consideration of end of November timeline, elections, October 3rd gives plenty of time for that to take place and to the city have dollars in the bank for projects. I don't want to thank you for the time. I think that's all I have. Sorry I threw a black screen on there for you, but I'm certainly open to take questions if you have them.
Questions? Thank you.
Okay, so the remainder of our meeting, I think it's scheduled for 60 minutes, so I'm not sure how long this will take. If your schedule allows and want to stay through the end, I would appreciate it. We just want to have conversation about the budget, where we are, and where we need to be and when. So page 17 is this particular table. We appreciate, as Michael mentioned, appreciate meeting with each of you last week, and this was one of the information that we provided. I just thought we've had several iterations of the budget, and I wanted to make sure that everyone was kind of on the same page with where we landed. So we have 24's actual approved budget, then we have the brown bag, the meeting on the 5th, and then the final meeting on the 12th. I highlighted in yellow the main points that came out of that meeting on the 12th. So we did set the mills cap at 55, and then what that means as far as the COLA and offsetting expense reductions or revenue increases that would be needed. So at 3.5% COLA, that difference is 400,000. 4%, the difference is 800,000, and to go up to 4.5, we would need to find $1.2 million. So we just put down a few, where's the goals and objectives? Goals and objectives for this meeting today. Michael, did you want to lead this part?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you, commissioners, for your time today. We really appreciate your discussions with us last week to talk about the preliminary budget. Appreciate the input. You asked some really good questions as well. We have some follow-up items that we'll reference today, and then some that we're still researching for you. But as referenced in our meetings last week, we're really wanting to make sure that we're providing you with the most relevant, timely information for you to make the best policy decisions you can for the budget document and for the organization in the future. We really see our role as the senior advisors to you. We represent the collective will of the board. We want to make sure that what we put together and what we land on is going to be responsive to the majority will of the commission. And so I would just also add that in addition to some of the information that we've assembled to date, we also wanted to take time today just to highlight some of what I'll call the critical path decisions that we need to make. What do I mean by critical path? By that, I mean really the COLA, as well as some of the additional expenditure reduction goals and perhaps revenue enhancements that we need to identify to move forward. It's really important that we coalesce around those. And you did establish with, as Susan said, the millage last week. With that action at the special commission meeting a week ago today, we established that 55 mills. And so with that, we would like to really hone in on is what that final COLA number should look like, given that we know what our revenue condition on the mills will look like in totality coming in. And so I would also add that some of the revenue enhancements, and it's summarized and wrapped up here, some of those revenue enhancements could be really great opportunities, but they might take some time. And it might be something that we just set a target. And so in addition to a COLA target or an expenditure reduction target, perhaps we also have a new revenue target for new opportunities, new positions, whatever it might be that could generate revenue. But I think most importantly, we want to make sure that whatever we do in the next month of time is representative of the majority will of the commission. And so those are just a couple of goals and objectives.
Michael, I know you move so fast, I'm trying to get a question in.
Yes, absolutely. Go
I'm
ahead.
just, the 55 established mill levy is absent the 2 mills for the airport. So we're really at 57 with the airport, aren't we?
57 total city Fargo's,
Yes.
2 airport, 55
So
city.
55, and this is the first year we've ever separated them out and looked at the non-airport and the airport. And in my mind, we're at 57 and we've approved 2 for the airport.
So
Typically,
just-
we look at them as separate because the general fund only brings in the city. So the 55 is what we look at.
And then on top of that, there's 2 for the airport.
Correct,
Correct.
yes.
Thank you.
Mike, can I ask a question real quick? A couple other topics that we talked about last week too is the health department. We have a new leader. And so if you could include that in there, just, they were gonna, is it in there and I just don't see it?
Yeah, so actually, if you look under programs on the bottom of that slide, what we talked about there is the engagement center. And then we also included, we had a great question last week too, just about the assessed value of the facilities that we might be able to sell someday, the old public health building, as well as the old PD. And we'll be keep working on that. But I just want to roll that up. On the very, very bottom of that slide is the Bloomberg study that we're going to look to keep looking at the location, the service level, and the funding level for the engagement center. And so that is rolled up on the program side. We also had a lot of feedback, a lot of input about if we were to try to look at the commission's desired outcomes in other operating areas, what other specific areas would commissioners like to see? So this is just a high-level summary. What, again, as I said earlier, what we would like to establish then, if, say, 4% is the COLA figure that we back into, that we then establish what our expenditure reductions should look like to try back into that over the next couple of weeks, 3 weeks, so that we can help you get to your finish line if that's your desire. And so that's really where we're at today.
Can I add one more, Mike? And maybe you talked about this too, but the health building, you have it on that slide talking about the Downtown Engagement Center building being assessed at 2.3 million. The building across the street is the former health center. So could we have that just, okay.
Yep, we have that too. It's not in the slide deck, but just for the commission's background, we did provide the tax analysis with James in the assessor's office on what that building is valued at as well, and kind of the market and the timing of when you might sell those assets, whether it be the old police department building as well as the old health building, doing some market analysis on that. To the point raised earlier by Susan, this was not a surprise to see in the ACFR and in the roll-up that as your general fund continues to grow, that we need to really be thinking about new reserve allocations in future years. Because as Brian had in that slide, we're going to continue to see that percentage of reserve fall relative to the size of our overall general fund. We think the sale of assets like that would be a great place to park some of those proceeds so that we're not spending those dollars, but rather investing those dollars in your reserves so that you are continuing to bump up that line as much as possible.
And to that point, public health building may be worth $2 million, Dave. We don't know that. And then, Main Avenue, we still have that parking lot that should be for sale. And we should look at the assessed value of that as well when we eventually can sell it. So those are some things that can help rebuild the reserve fund.
So the purpose of this slide was to kind of summarize the themes that we heard at the various meetings and also individually when we talked with you. So obviously compensation and where we land on that. The departments, continue to review. I mean, our task as the budget team is to go back now and take this information that we learned and try to roll it up into something that we can reach into consensus on. So the compensation, different department needs, the program needs, and then on the next page, there were a couple other things we wanted to bring to mind. When we met with what we heard from Commissioner Strand, and then he had some questions that we thought, everyone should see. The comment of tighten the belt. We feel like we were pretty thorough in our review, pretty conservative in our zero general fund FTE adds. We had really pretty minimal other general fund increases. On an ongoing basis, we continue to look at centralized purchasing and how we can save money that way, and department dialogue, including, Jen in the health department. She's very new. We started this budget process in April, so she wasn't real involved in that, but has jumped right in, and we're going to have some conversations with her this week. And then just in general, project outsourcing versus insourcing. That was a question that Commissioner Strand raised as far as the use of consultants, so that's something we'll continue to be mindful of. And then you had actually raised the question about what other entities is the city supporting, and so those are two different general ledger accounts that I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention. One is primarily economic, and one is a little more social and arts, but that is what is currently in the budget for this year.
I think the other thing, Commissioner Turnberg, you're new to this commission, but we had significant contributions to the Workforce Academy beyond this to help with the build of the Workforce Academy. And Fueling Our Future, we had a significant contribution to Fueling Our Future. Those are both gone, and those would be considerable amount of money that would have been into this, but those presently are gone. A lot of these are things that we've moved away from our some of our areas to help with workforce and workforce initiatives, help our people with the snow removal, community land trust, different elements that we have been active in, but we've not had a lot of staff in those areas. So it does help the city be part of the workforce and what goes on. The economic development is still much less than the county. The county puts in almost 700 to 800,000 into that. So this is just kind of, Commissioner Strand had asked the question about where are we in some of our services.
Do we have any programs that were funded through COVID money that we continue to operate? Where that money isn't coming in anymore, but we're still providing the service?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit earlier, and Brian had a great slide. And when you talk about the act for, the declining federal support, those dollars are being drawn down, finishing some of the funding of certain activities, programs, et cetera. So we've had a share of funds that have gone to health programs. We've had a share of funds that have gone to other special community interest programs like outside organizations. Some of those have ended, and then there are others that continue and that will continue in the future. I think one of the debt conversations is we can absolutely go in some different directions. There are Bloomberg studies helping us think about that, but it's going to take a bit of time to do that. And so before we kind of put a specific dollar amount to it, we want to make sure that we understand kind of what the future revenue conditions would look like as well with that. But we'd be happy to provide kind of a snapshot. I'll put that in my list, a snapshot of current CARES and ARP. We were getting to the very end of CARES and ARP, but we'd be happy to provide that.
It's about all gone.
I'll chime in on this page here, and Susan and team and Michael, thank you for assembling the beginnings of this. This is some of the, we really went through some detail last week. These back to core services, that's what I call low-hanging fruit. It doesn't mean that we address all these. Like I have hesitations about the special assessment assistance and snow removal assistance, but they're in that category. These other categories, it's not necessarily core mission work. So that's low-hanging fruit. Our primary discussion last week was focused on what can we address immediately and get some maybe tangible, quick results on. Longer term, and still for this budget cycle, I'm looking forward to, and you mentioned consultants, and I don't know, but I would like to know if there's any ways we can, get some breathing room with consultant activities. A big one, tax breaks and incentives. At some point, we need to look at tax breaks and incentives. Is it in today's world where we all want to be still or not? I want to learn more. That's not tomorrow's discussion, but it's coming. Moratorium, or I'll use the word sabbatical, on some boards and commissions. If nothing else, we can relieve some of our core staff people to go back to their jobs instead of sitting in some meetings sometimes that pulls them off their work. If we're not growing their workforce, let's let them hone in on what they're supposed to be doing. That's one other topic. Travel, I think we can look at travel. Meals and expenses. In-house legal department versus an out-house legal department, that's a topic that's been bubbling up for years. I don't know. But is there a viable consideration to hire our own legal team versus not? These are topics that I look at. Generally speaking, vacancies, overtime, contracted services, equipment purchases, CIP. When the COVID hit, we immediately looked at our CIP and found a little bit of room to get some time. And so these are longer term topics that aren't quite so much low hanging fruit tomorrow, like some of our grants and pass-through grants for arts and culture and other entities. Little thing, but it adds up. And we're not doing it today, and I'm glad. I'm glad we're not walking in here today and getting fed lunch. But it adds up. Those things add up. And it tells the public where we're really looking to, because in my head, our workforce is our most highest priority, and the existing workforce we have right now, retaining them, taking care of them, giving them as much deserved, relative, comparable, competitive pay and compensation. So as you're looking at these topics here, this is the beginnings of what I look at as what we can explore, like, is this essential? Is this essential? Is this core mission? Is this core mission? That kind of stuff, and I'll stop there.
Mr. Chair. So I have a couple things that I want to talk about. First of all, I appreciate the meeting we had last week and the conversation and the questions really we've been asking of staff for the last 6 months. This process began 6 months ago, and having met with, of course, all of my departments, but learning more about others as part of this process, it's much appreciated. I know finance, together with administration, has done yeoman's work here to find these cuts. So I'll start there. For me, still number one priority, and believe me, Team Fargo is listening to these conversations, it's Team Fargo. We began this year with a look at compensation, and we know we're behind. And it's going to take a couple years of thoughtful strategy to get us where we need to be. Just this week, we lost a technical person on Team Fargo who went to a consulting firm. We're now going to be paying 30% more because of wages and salaries, and we're going to see more and more of that. So I would ask that finance with our city administrator and assistant city administrator sit down with the entire cabinet and look for cuts collectively and strategically together as a cabinet. What can be cut for us to get to at least a 4.5% COLA this year? And then also with cabinet, define and bring back the draft compensation philosophy that next year will help us get to the gap of where we know we are when it comes to compensation. So that would be my request, is still to focus on our priority, Team Fargo, who provide the day in and day out services to the citizens of Fargo. And we're losing to private industry right now because of our wages. And it's fire, it's police, but it's every department. And I think collectively that wisdom and the leadership can find those cuts to get us to 4.5% at a minimum. The last thing I'm going to say is I'm tired of the disingenuous comments about our communication and government affairs team. It started with a story from a media outlet that had a number of omissions in it. The work they do is mission critical to the city of Fargo and the citizens of Fargo. They broadcast 30 meetings a month so that we have transparency in government. They respond to over 2,000 open records requests a year. They have 24/7 literally on-call media reaction because of police and fire, but literally 24/7 on-call team members that respond to media inquiries day in and day out. They release at least 10 press releases that talk about roads and closures and events in the city. And they work an average of 47 to 60 hours a week, the entire team. So the last thing I'm going to share is the reason they grew over the last 4 years, which, by the way, was all approved by PEC and the Finance Committee, of which 2 commissioners sat on, after very thoughtful rationalization to grow their team. 25% of their members came from the police department. So they integrated a former team that was sat at the police department into the comms team, which grew them to their current model today, which is more efficient and sits with 12 members that do the work day in and day out on the website, on the social channels, curating content. I am tired of the disingenuous comments with no facts behind them. And I 100% support the entire Team Fargo and the work that they do. And I think we need to stand behind our teams and support them for that work. Those are my comments.
Go over time, Susan.
This is just to wrap up and kind of give you our next steps. So obviously, the budget team is going to go back to work. We will discuss these themes that we keep hearing and have continued dialogue with the departments. We do have the public hearing set at the commission meeting on September 16th. I think I mentioned this in our meetings, but I would like to propose that instead of quarterly finance, we move to bi-monthly. I think we have a lot of information that we could fill up those extra meetings. And I think the first one should start next month. That would give us some time to talk through the budget again if there's additional conversations need to be had before the final vote on September 30th.
I have the dumbest question in the world. When you say bi-monthly meetings, is it an adverb or adjective? Is it every other month or is it twice a month?
Every other, that's
Every
what I
other,
meant.
thank you.
Maybe, I'm an accountant, not an English major, but that's what I meant.
So from this meeting today, basically, and from all the commissioners' discussion with the budget team, we will go back and talk to department heads, all the departments, and see if there's anything else. I'm happy to report, and just talking to Jen, she looked at some charges that she could do that would add some revenue. So we are having some talks about different people on revenue. We've talked to other departments, and they've also talked about looking at all the different areas and where revenue might need to be charged. Sometimes as a city, we've always been very, generous not to make it too high. We want to make sure people can afford whatever we're trying to do. So I think that we asked in cabinet today, let's look at everything that we've got on the table and see if there's other ways to help. But I think what you did as commissioners, you empowered the budget team to make some decisions, which you talked to them about, that we'll begin to enact over the next 3 weeks and see what we can bring back to you. If there's something different, if you see something that Mike and Susan are trying to bring forth, then please tell us. But I think we have taken very seriously the discussions you've had with them, and we will look at that. 800,000 is a lot of money, so we will see what we can do. But just bear in mind, we're trying to follow what we think is your consensus. So thank you.